While I'm not expressly going to talk a lot about the kind of theoretical shaping of what I'm going to say, you could read what I'm going to say as Bourdieu light. I'm going to bring together Bourdieu. I will refer to a few other bits of theory as well, but the presentation is shaped in a kind of Bourdieusian way. But I'm also going to bring feminist theory to what I'm going to say as well. That's not an unusual combination. You know, people like, so Lois McNay, for example, talks about Bourdieu bringing materiality to feminism. Bev Skeggs talks about Bourdieu providing explanatory power. I've argued in a book not very long ago about Bourdieu that I think it's a helpful way to kind of think. And in some ways, my view is that gets beyond the kind of methodological nationalism, if you understand Bourdieu, as a set of tools, as an orientation towards what kind of questions you might ask and how you might frame up an empirical project. So I've approached really thinking about writing here as a kind of potential empirical project in a way, in which we're all involved and we're all implicated. And I'm particularly implicated, I think, because I end up giving a lot of workshops and running courses around academic writing. I've always taught writing. In fact, higher education is my second career. Like a number of you, I had a long career in schools, probably longer than any of you, because I was 27 years in a school system, so I'm, you know, old. But always taught writing. So I'm interested in the process of writing. And having encountered Bourdieu quite early as a teacher, actually, because in Australia there was a big program called the Disadvantaged Schools Program, which ran from the early 1970s right through to the mid-90s. It was the second longest running poverty program in the world. But it was a very interesting coming together of teachers and academics. There was lots of reading, shared reading and discussion that went on. And Bourdieu made sense to me as a teacher, and it made sense to me of the kind of way that you approach kids in a class, saying, well, you know, the exams are wrong, you know, exams are really not what it's about. Nevertheless, you want to pass them, so we've got to play this game. Yeah, so the kind of Bourdieusian notion of the game, of doing something because you needed it for particular kinds of reasons in order to get life chances, generally advance in the field. But there was other stuff that you might do as well, and also you might be thinking about how in fact the game could be changed. So, and that made a lot of sense to me as a teacher, that kind of notion of the three-handedness of playing the game, doing something else as well, and trying to undo the game. So that's very much the way that I still approach the process of academic writing. So, you know, in my blog and in my books, for example, it's partly about how you play the game of getting published. But at the same time, I don't want to suggest, and I'll elaborate on that the game is okay. But I'm going to start in a kind of very Bourdieusian fashion. So I want to say a little bit about, you know, what Suresh Kanagaraja helpfully talks about in his book about academic publishing, called The Geopolitics of Academic Publishing. And I think that we want to start by actually recognising that this is a highly profitable business for a number of the companies that are engaged in academic publication, and that what's gone on over the last few years has been an incredible kind of concentration, really, of academic publishing in the hands of relatively few publishers. Those that have more, and those that have actually expand their offerings at the same time as acquiring more. So, you know, Elsevier is the biggest academic publisher by far. And if you just have a look at some of this, is from a recent article in The Guardian, source of all knowledge. which says, you know, 1.5 million papers a year, 14 million scientists entrust in Elsevier, 800,000 scientists donate their time to help them with editing and peer review. And this is it's a very interesting paper, because article actually worth having a look at, because it basically focuses on the con that we've all become part of. That, you know, it's in dreams of it's a kind of scheme that most business people could only dream of. They do very little work. They annex a huge amount of free labour to actually develop the product, and then they sell it at ever increasing prices to a kind of captive market who actually rely on what it is that they sell. It's one of the most profitable industries in the world, academic publishing. But you know what they say is, we help researchers to be more productive and efficient. And that's a win for research institutions and for research funders like government. So, you know, they have a nice way of explaining it. But of course, this is an old kind of graph, and you can get more up-to-date ones. What I think we know in institutions is that despite the amount of labour that we're putting in, despite the increasing amount of labour we're putting in, our institutions are having increasing amounts of difficulty actually buying the stuff which we then want to read. Subscription prices have just gone up exponentially, and at the first sign of a boycott, and there have been boycotts, the publishers respond very rapidly and offer a few kind of sweeteners to undercut that, because they can't afford to have the whole thing come crumbling down. And they are continually thinking of ways to refine their offerings. So the process of bundling, for example, was a strategy that Elsevier introduced that all the rest of them now do, where libraries are offered, you know, a set of stuff they do want with a bunch of stuff that they're not, and they have to basically buy the package. So when we're thinking about academic publishing, I think that's the first thing we have to think about, is that this is some of the logic of what's actually going on in the field. And it's a logic that we're all kind of dependent on. We're also in a situation where there are now increasing numbers of people who are interested in taking advantage of this. So this is an old kind of slide, but I just like the shark's fin, of course, being Australian, particularly fond of the shark's fin. But the increase in kind of predatory journals and journals, unprincipled journals of various kinds that are there to try and extract people's product, if you like, your work, you know, our stuff, from us. Beall's list has gone down now, and he's been basically, he's a librarian in the US, he's basically had to take it down. His institution was pressured in all kinds of ways, and he's written recently about the process of being bullied into taking down his list. But as well, people are getting more sophisticated about what they do, these kinds of publishers. So you've probably all had those messages from people saying, "Dear so-and-so, we consider you to be an expert on blah, and we read your paper X in Y, da-da-da-da-da." Mostly you can pick what that is. Some of them are getting pretty interesting, but there's a new strategy which has just emerged. So and it's so new I haven't actually got it on a slide. But this is a mob called the International Agency for Development of Culture, Education and Science. And on their website they list a number of journals, including British Education Research Journal, British Journal of Education Studies, British Journal of Education Technology. They've taken the text direct from the journal websites, they list the editorial boards, so it looks extremely legit. It doesn't have the same kind of crap grammar and just give us your money kind of call that some of these other emails that you get actually have. But ultimately, this is a kind of, we offer you a shortcut to publication, just dump your paper and money in the slot, and of course nothing will ever happen. But this looks much more legitimate than anything that's gone before. Needless to say, the publishers are having emergency meetings to try and work out how they can get this taken down. I had this yesterday in an email from a publisher because I'm an editor of a journal. We get this kind of information. It hasn't gone public yet. I dare say they won't be able to keep a lid on it for very long. Times Higher will have it probably very soon. But this is a new move in this kind of game. So it's not only the case that, you know, the legit publishers are making a truckload out of our work, but there are other people trying to profit from it as well. Welcome to the Academy. I think another thing we have to think about is that in the field, academic publications are proliferating, and there's a whole range of reasons for that. At least in part, there's the kind of incentive of league tables and metrics, and they're largely based on citation indices which are based on English language publications. So read from that the beginning of an argument I'm going to make, obviously, about publishing in English as part of the way the field operates and increasing dominance of English in the field. The PhD by publication has also, and its spread, has also led to an increase in publication, and some of you here are doing PhDs by publication, I know. This is a very vexed beast, the PhD by publication. Now, I can talk more about that later, but it's not consistent across countries, it's not consistent across institutions, it's not consistent across disciplines, and it is certainly adding to the proliferation of journal articles that are out there. As is, of course, stuff like promotion practices, which are increasingly dependent on publication track record, audit systems which are tied to international league tables, and national funding systems which are also based around not only research income but publication output. All of these things are kind of leading to a proliferation of publishing, but an absolute increase in English language journals. The big publishers who head up the field publish in the English language. They're not local, national kinds of journals. And I can remember when I first went, I think, to an ESA conference, I can remember I don't think this network was established then, but I can remember hearing Sverker Lindblad documenting the number of journals in Swedish and Norwegian that had gone under. And at the time, NERA, the Nordic Education Research Association, had just converted its proceedings to English. So, you know, the PhD by publication in most places is not simply about publication, it's about publication in the English language. So this is just part of the kind of, if you like, a sort of a long history of English language kind of colonialism that's been accelerated. Interestingly, of course, there are still large numbers of journals that are published in languages other than English, but they're generally only known to people within their kind of locale. And there are actually indices of those journals that are available, but most people don't know that they exist. Most people in English-speaking countries don't know they exist. So, kind of publishing in general and publishing in English, and a lot of associated stuff that goes with it, like you have to publish in the most highly cited journal. You have to publish stuff that's been peer-reviewed. You can't write a book anymore. Chapters are useless. There's a lot of kind of advice which assumes, particularly as it becomes taken into institutions, assumes the kind of status of a doxa, or as Foucault would have it, it's a kind of regime of truth about all of this process. It produces us as particular kinds of academic subjects. But in this, I think it's worth understanding that it's not only English, it's a particular kind of English that's acceptable. And English is spoken in a whole range of places around the world, but only particular forms of it are acceptable. So if you look at the APA manual, for example, a lot of US journals use the APA manual, then it will say no vernacular, right? And I've certainly had a very long and extended fight with an editor of the American Education Research Journal about a phrase that he thought was vernacular, which was getting a grip on something, and he said getting a grip is vernacular, and I said no, getting a grip on is a legitimate expression. But you know, and so even people like me, you know, get picked up on in some of these kind of style manuals, let alone if you're somebody from for example from Delhi, from the University of Delhi, who's using a form of Indian English which has been spoken in India for a very long time now, and is a legitimate form of expression. And Suresh Kanagaraja he's a fantastic Sri Lankan academic who's now based in the US, tells a lovely story of taking his US doctorate, I think from Wisconsin Medicine, back to Sri Lanka and what happened, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, but the result of that in a minute, but he keeps doing work around world Englishes, and he has documented the ways in which world Englishes are acceptable in some genres and some conversations. So in conference proceedings, for example, in a presentation, it's perfectly acceptable. It might even be acceptable in a promotion application, but it's not acceptable in a peer-reviewed journal. Although some peer-reviewed journals are more relaxed about different kind of syntactical forms of English than others. But nevertheless, there is a kind of prioritising of a particular form of English which was kind of ossified and categorised actually not that long ago. You know, so, you know, English is a kind of, like all languages, changes all the time. And the other thing, of course, we have to understand is that academic writing is a particular kind of genre. Okay, so the social science genre, which you all have to adhere to generally in education, is an argument. Okay, and the argument basically always goes, I'm going to argue blah, and I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I've done blah, I'm going to move on to this. So there's a lot of use of meta-commentary, there's a lot of use of a particular, like a Greek chorus almost, standing alongside the main argument going, now they've done that, now they've done, right? So that's the kind of English language genre of argument. Now that's not the only way to write an academic paper. Back to Kanagaraja. When he took his nice shiny PhD from Wisconsin Medicine back to Sri Lanka and did his first presentation and went, ladies and gentlemen, tonight I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, several of them got up and walked out. And by the end of it, after he'd done, I've done A, B, C and D and, you know, I've shown you this and da-da-la, most of them were furious because they felt that they'd been infantilised by this process. And it is the case across Europe that there are long traditions of different forms of academic writing. Some of them are more poetic, some of them are much more kind of cross-textual in the way that they use citations and refer to particular kinds of works. Some of them, I think, Paolo, you were explaining in Italian, it's more about the kind of form and people work their way through something and you arrive at the conclusion at the end, you're not told at the start. So, you know, there's a kind of cultural imperialism of thinking that is implied in English language publication. It's not simply that you're being asked to publish in English, you're actually being asked to assume a particular cultural tradition of academic writing at the same time. And you're also being asked very often, well, I was delighted to see you didn't do it today, Eric, you're also often being asked to abandon words that are important conceptually, but are actually untranslatable. So, you know, the standard British understanding of pedagogy is a much reduced beast from the way it's generally used in other parts in Europe. Bildung doesn't exist, you know, except for people that have struggled, like some of us in this room probably, to actually understand what it means, because there isn't an equivalent in English. So, you know, there's sets of issues here about trying to translate your traditions of understanding and knowing and scholarship into English language, and having to make them, bearing the burden of making them comprehensible to English language readers. So that's part of the game that's going on. In places like New Zealand, Māori scholars have begun to put their foot down. They won't do it. And they routinely introduce the correct, in their terms, correct Māori terminology for what it is they're trying to describe. So in other words, if there is no English equivalent, they use the Māori epistemology, and some quite often quite ontological as well, and offer some kind of explanation, but then continue to use that term. And in scholarship, educational scholarship in New Zealand, many of those Māori terms have now entered educational discourse. So there's been some kind of stepping back and some understanding that, you know, if you're going to actually talk about, in a post-colonial context, if you're going to talk about education, then it's not that the Māori didn't know anything. They had a pretty good curriculum actually before the white fellas landed. So that's part of this process that's going on in the shift to English language publication. There's also, of course, a really dreadful lack of translation of books and papers that are published in languages other than English. So, and you know, people like me and a lot of people in Australia and in Britain, for example, are pretty monolingual compared to a lot of other places. So we can't kind of understand and get access to those materials because the publishers certainly don't make funding available to translate. They generally don't do bilingual publication. There's a bit of bilingual publication. You'll see it in Canada. You'll see some Spanish-English publications. But there's not a lot of that goes on. It's enough for you to notice it when you actually see it. So there's lots of stuff that people in English language countries and where the English language journals are based, lots of stuff that we're completely ignorant about. We just don't know what the traditions are. And therefore we very rarely cite them. You know, not only do we mostly cite blokes, we also very rarely cite things that are published in other languages. And, you know, that's part of this kind of, part of the way the field works. So I'm going to come back to this because I guess it's one of the things I want us to think about. I want us to think about the sociology of education kind of network. What is it about your traditions of sociological thought that the rest of us actually need to know about, and how is it that we could think about some strategies that might make people like me understand some more of that and have access to those kinds of resources? How can we fight back against some of these kinds of ways, logics within the field? The other thing I think that's happening is, of course, the move to open access. At the same time as there's been a kind of proliferation of journal articles, we've also journals. We've also got a proliferation of books, and sales of books are not flash. We've also got the development of digital scholarship. So think about these things going on at the same time. By and large, now this is a UK project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in conjunction with the British Library. 2-year project. You can find the website. In the humanities in the UK, in the US, in Australia by and large, people still write monographs for their PhD. So in other words, they're being prepared to actually write a book. There are obviously a set of affordances about a book that you don't get in a journal article, and vice versa. So one of the things a book allows you to do, of course, is to develop a very extended sort of argument over lots of words. You can also play with genres a lot more in a book, and indeed in a book chapter, than you can in most journal articles, unless you're going to a kind of an aberrant, more interesting journal like Qualitative Inquiry. But by and large, we're still teaching in a lot of universities people to produce the monograph as the kind of gold standard, with the expectation actually that this is going to situate them to write books. But, you know, academic monographs are pretty crap sellers. They don't do much for their publishers anymore. A lot of humanities books sell around 50 copies, and that's it. Right? So and that's largely just going into libraries. So this is in a commercial big publisher. In order to, you know, get any profit on a book, an academic publisher generally wants to sell about 350. So they're looking at a combination of, you know, so a publisher like Routledge or Springer, for example, they're looking to sell a lot to libraries and a few to kind of individual people, the author and their mates and a few other people who are interested in the topic. However, I think we also know that open access books, like digital theses, actually get a lot more readers than this. So within these kinds of logics, there are other things happening. We've got the logic of audit, the logic of promotion, the logic of league tables, which appears to support the big publishers, but we've also got these kind of counter moves within the field, you know, the fields are agonistic, around things like open access, and particularly where academics are taking charge of their own publishing. So for instance, I can think of Punctum Books in the UK, Kismet Books in the UK, which are both set up as social enterprises, which are set up by academics, which have ISBN numbers, which publish open access books, and they can do print on demand for people that want them for pretty reasonable kinds of prices. So there are these kind of moves going on in the field that are important. It's important to note, I think, that, you know, lots of people don't write books at all, and this kind of perspective, the academic book of the future, is a very kind of Western perspective. And in places like Africa, there's a very nice post by Ola Okulu on the Academic Book of the Future post, where she explains the way in which this kind of Western political economy of English language publication, what that looks like from an African perspective. And I think it's really worth our while to try and understand that, and to think about what that might mean for our publications. So just as an instance of a small thing that one person can do, I paid to have my blog changed to a URL that didn't have wordpress.com on it, because I know that anything with wordpress.com on it is censored in China. Okay, so there are things that even individual people can do at the level, and you know, without falling into Bourdieu's biographical illusion about the individual, but there are things that people like me, my position, can actually do in this kind of field context. And I think it's important to understand as well, you know, why we publish and what that actually means. So we don't actually publish for the ref, the audit. We don't publish to make profits for publishers. So at the same time as that's going on, there are other reasons that we might want to think about why we continue to publish. And, you know, and obviously it's got to do with communication. It's got to do with kind of communities of scholars and potentially other people who want to be part of the same kinds of conversations. So, you know, that on the one hand is exclusive, as de Certeau points out in his kind of writing about what he calls the scriptural economy, where he talks about the kind of long line of writing that emerged from monks chained to their desk to produce the most powerful texts, ecclesiastical texts, which were tied up with social privilege and power, and the kind of, I guess, the kind of practice that Bourdieu talks about in writing about the academy, and which the late Brian Street, I don't know if any of you knew Brian Street, he's one of the founders of, if you like, the most important people in what are called the new literacy studies. He's just passed away last week. Was an ethnographer of writing, one of the people who looked at practices as opposed to anything else. And he talks about the way in which we're implicated in the reproduction of power. So I think it's easy, for us to misrecognise our own, either the doxa that we're told about why publishing is necessary, or our own kind of doxa about why it's important, to misrecognise the fact that the practices that we're engaged in are part of those practices which produce and reproduce kind of existing relations of power more broadly in society. And I think Brian's kind of statement here is a very old one, is a good reminder, I think, of that. And it's helpful when we're focused on our own plight, I think, to remember what it is, how it is that academic writing functions. For example, anthropologists were entirely complicit in the practices of empire and with museums, and their writings were highly significant in genocidal practices and all kinds of things. And as an example, something that anthropologists have been wrestling with for the last 50 years, but it is nevertheless the practice, and anthropologists are still partly complicit with kind of the colonial project or projects.